New York, December. The frosty air permeated the streets of Manhattan, forcing passersby to wrap themselves in their coats and walk faster. The snow had not yet fallen, but it seemed that the cold was already enveloping the city. Outside one of the shops, where the windows shone with bright Christmas lights, a quiet voice was heard, barely audible amidst the noise of cars and the din of the crowd. "Please help." A man in a long dark coat and red tie slowed his pace. His inner voice said, "Just keep walking," as he had done hundreds of times before. But this time he couldn't. In front of him sat a weary woman, her tired eyes staring into space. In her hands, she held a cardboard sign, a veteran without a home. "Help." He took a step forward, not realizing that this meeting would change everything. New York, December. The air was sharp, cutting through the city like a blade. The streets of Manhattan bustled with life, car horns blaring, hurried footsteps echoing off tall buildings, voices blending into an urban symphony. Holiday lights twinkled in shop windows, casting a false warmth over the frozen sidewalks. Among the moving crowd, a man walked with steady confidence. His navy blue coat billowed slightly with each step, and his red tie stood out like a bold streak against the gray cityscape. Richard Walters was a man used to control, to making decisions that shaped industries and commanded respect. He had places to be, calls to make, deals to close. Then he heard it, a whisper, or maybe a plea. Asterisk, "Please help." Asterisk. His stride faltered. It would have been easy to keep walking. He had done it before countless times. The city was full of people like this, faces blurred by hardship, forgotten by a system that had no use for them. He told himself he couldn't fix everything, couldn't stop for every lost soul. But then he saw her. She sat against the cold brick wall of a storefront, wrapped in a threadbare coat that did little to shield her from the freezing air. Her hands, cracked and raw from the cold, clutched a worn piece of cardboard. Veteran in need. "Please help." Her gaze wasn't pleading. It wasn't desperate. It was empty. Richard hesitated. There was something in her eyes, something familiar, a kind of exhaustion he had seen before, not in strangers, but in people who had once stood strong before the world took everything from them. Memories stirred in his mind. A friend, a colleague, someone who had given everything, only to be cast aside when they were no longer useful. He clenched his jaw, and then, against every instinct telling him to move on, he stepped forward. She didn't react at first. She was used to people walking by, barely sparing her a glance. But when the shadow in front of her didn't move, she finally looked up. "Ma'am," Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What's your name?" She blinked, as if trying to remember it herself. "Sarah," she said after a pause. "Sarah Lewis." He crouched down, leveling his gaze with hers. "You're a veteran?" A slow nod. 12 years. Deployed overseas. Got injured. Things didn't go as planned after that. Her voice was hoarse, either from the cold or from disuse. Richard took a slow breath. He glanced down at the sign, at her trembling hands, then back at her face. "Why are you out here?" A humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Because there was nowhere else to go." Richard slipped his hand into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone. "Stay here," he said. Sarah smirked weakly. "Not like I have anywhere else to be." He turned away slightly, dialing a number he knew by heart. The call was answered immediately. "Lori," he said, his tone all business. "I need the nearest hotel with an available room. And find a doctor. Someone who could do a checkup on short notice." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Right away, Mr. Walters." He ended the call and turned back to Sarah. "Help is on the way." She exhaled, the faintest trace of skepticism in her expression. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard held her gaze. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." Richard ended the call and exhaled slowly, watching the frozen air dissipate in front of him. Sarah was still sitting against the cold brick wall, her posture tense despite the exhaustion in her eyes. She had heard empty promises before, seen fleeting kindness turn to indifference. Trust was a luxury she no longer afforded. The city carried on around them, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding on the sidewalk. Cars rushed by, headlights cutting through the dim light, and pedestrians walked past without a glance. To them, she was just another nameless figure blending into the backdrop of hardship that had become too familiar to notice. Richard reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of his gloves before pulling out his phone again. The response from Lori came swiftly. There was a hotel nearby, but they refused to check in anyone without identification. The same issue arose with the doctor. No ID, no room. No insurance, no real medical help. Of course, he tightened his grip on the phone, frustration simmering beneath the surface. It was a cruel paradox. Those who had given everything to serve their country now found themselves abandoned by the very institutions meant to protect them. Rules, policies, regulations, all conveniently designed to exclude the people who needed help the most. Sarah watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to ask. She already knew what the answer was. The way she pulled the tattered coat tighter around herself, the way her shoulders sank slightly. It was the posture of someone who had heard the same rejection too many times to be surprised anymore. Richard didn't bother explaining. Words wouldn't fix this. Instead, he took off his scarf and handed it to her. For a moment, she hesitated, but the bitter wind was relentless. Finally, she wrapped it around her neck, her fingers lingering on the soft fabric. It had been a long time since she had felt warmth that wasn't from a fire barrel on a street corner. 15 minutes later, the sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the city lights. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Sarah didn't move. The offer was too big, too sudden. Instinct told her to retreat, to stay where she was, to avoid another letdown. Trusting meant risking, and she had nothing left to lose except the last piece of herself that still held onto hope. Richard didn't pressure her. He simply stood, waiting. Minutes passed before she inhaled deeply, pushing against the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. Then, without a word, she stood up and climbed into the car. The door shut behind her, sealing her off from the cold. The SUV moved smoothly through the crowded streets of Manhattan, the city alive with flashing lights and hurried pedestrians. Inside, the warmth of the heater filled the space, but Sarah remained still, her body rigid. She kept her gaze fixed outside the window, watching as familiar streets blurred past her. It felt surreal, being in a car again, feeling the steady hum of an engine beneath her instead of the cold pavement. Richard sat beside her, silent. He had seen this kind of tension before, the way people condition themselves not to hope too much, not to believe in anything that could be taken away. He didn't try to reassure her. He had learned long ago that actions meant more than words. Lori's voice came through the speakerphone. She had arranged for a room, but there was resistance from the hotel staff. They were reluctant to admit someone without proper documentation. There were concerns about policy and precedent. Richard's patience thinned. He had dealt with red tape his entire career, but nothing infuriated him more than bureaucracy standing in the way of basic humanity. "We're almost there," Lori said. Richard glanced at Sarah. She hadn't reacted to the conversation, her expression unreadable. The car pulled up to the hotel entrance. The golden glow from the lobby windows spilled onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent streets. A doorman stood at the entrance, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. Richard stepped out first, signaling for Sarah to follow. She hesitated. The weight of years spent on the outside made it hard to cross thresholds meant for people who belonged. A deep breath. Then she stepped out. Inside, the lobby was warm, filled with the quiet murmur of guests checking in, the scent of polished wood and fresh coffee hanging in the air. The receptionist barely concealed her skepticism when she saw Sarah. "We've been expecting you," the woman said, her voice professional but guarded. Richard handed over his credit card, his tone making it clear there would be no discussion. "She's a guest. Treat her as such." The receptionist nodded, quickly finalizing the check-in. A bellhop arrived, offering to take any luggage, but Sarah simply shook her head. The only belongings she had were the clothes on her back. A key card was placed on the counter. Room 1210. She picked it up slowly, running her fingers over the smooth plastic. It felt too easy too unreal. The elevator ride was silent. As the door slid open on the 12th floor, she followed Richard down the hallway. He stopped in front of her door, but didn't move to open it. Instead, he handed her the key. No instructions. No conditions. Just choice. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted the card and pushed the door open. The room was simple but elegant. A large bed, neatly made with crisp white sheets. A hot shower waiting behind a frosted glass door. A window overlooking the city, where the skyline stretched endlessly into the night. She stepped inside, but didn't let go of the door. The fear of waking up back on the sidewalk still lingered. Richard remained by the doorway, watching but not intruding. She turned slightly, her voice quiet. "What happens now?" He didn't hesitate. "That's up to you." Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her alone with the chance she never thought she'd have again. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the quiet hotel room. The warmth inside felt foreign, almost suffocating after so many nights bracing against the cold. She let her fingers trail along the smooth surface of the nightstand, half expecting it to vanish under her touch. The silence pressed in. For months, her nights had been filled with the hum of the city, sirens wailing in the distance, the murmurs of other homeless people staking their corners, the rustling of plastic bags as she tried to get comfortable on the pavement. Now, there was nothing but the soft hum of the heater and the muffled city noise beyond the thick glass of the window. She took a hesitant step forward. The bed looked untouched, the sheets too clean, too perfect. She didn't sit. She wasn't sure she could. Instead, she moved toward the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a face she barely recognized. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, lines of exhaustion etched deep into her skin. Dirt clung to the edges of her fingernails, and her hair, once neatly tied back during her years of service, now hung in uneven strands. She turned on the faucet. The water ran clear, hot. She let her fingers hover beneath it before finally cupping some in her hands, splashing it onto her face. She peeled off her worn coat, feeling the weight of it for the first time in months. The fabric had absorbed too many nights of sleeping outside, too many storms, too much of a past she was desperate to escape. It landed on the floor with a dull thud. Stepping into the shower, she let the water run over her, scalding at first, then soothing. She stood still, feeling it wash over her like a tide, carrying away layers of grime, exhaustion, and something deeper, something harder to name. When she finally stepped out, she wrapped herself in a towel, feeling lighter but exposed. She spotted a set of neatly folded clothes on the dresser. New, unfamiliar. She hesitated before reaching for them. Dressed in clean fabric, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the city lights. She had spent years out there, moving between shadows, unnoticed by the world that kept turning without her. Now, she was here, in a place where no one would wake her up and tell her to move, where she didn't have to guard her belongings in fear of losing them. And yet, she still felt like an outsider. She lay back on the bed, the mattress too soft, the pillows too thick. Sleep didn't come easily. Her body still remembered the concrete beneath her, the way she curled up against the cold, the way she never allowed herself to fully relax. Even in comfort, her mind remained on edge, waiting for the moment when all of this would be taken away. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the hotel room. Sarah stirred but didn't open her eyes right away. The sheets felt too smooth, the air too still. For a moment, she braced herself for the harsh reality of waking up outside, the cold seeping into her bones, the distant rumble of traffic her only company. But when she finally opened her eyes, she was still there. She sat up slowly, running her fingers over the edge of the blanket. The weight of it felt unfamiliar, comforting yet unsettling. A knock at the door made her flinch. On the other side, a hotel staff member had left a tray, breakfast, neatly arranged, steam rising from the coffee cup. She hesitated before bringing it inside, unsure of what to do with the small luxury. Hunger won. She ate in silence, tasting real food for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight of the previous night settled over her. She had spent years in survival mode, moving from place to place, never expecting stability. Now, she was being handed something she had stopped believing in, a second chance. A folder sat on the table, left there by Richard before he had walked away. Inside, there were documents, temporary housing options, job placement programs, veteran support services, all neatly arranged, as if her life could be rebuilt with a few signatures. She stared at the pages for a long time. The past had taught her not to trust things that seemed too easy. She had spent years watching people fall through the cracks, promises made and broken, help offered with conditions attached. This was different, but the fear remained. What if she failed again? She took a slow breath, gripping the pen in her hand. Signing meant accepting that she could move forward, that she was more than the version of herself who had sat against that cold brick wall the night before. The ink met the paper. It didn't erase the past. It didn't fix everything, but it was a step. She packed the few belongings given to her, running her hand one last time over the smooth hotel sheets. Then she stood, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the door. The city outside hadn't changed. It still moved at its relentless pace, indifferent to her existence. But for the first time in years, she felt like she had a place in it again.